Hi, this is Tucker Goodrich. I am here with my co-host, Dr. Brian Kerley, and we are delighted to be joined today by Chef Andrew Gruel. Andrew, say hi so everybody can see you.
All right. Hey, everybody. How you doing?
And we're going to refer to him as Chef because apparently that's how it's done. Chef has been a restaurateur. He sold a company called Slapdash, which was a fish restaurant, a chain of, I guess, 30 odd restaurants. And he's now gone and reopened another restaurant. He's also been, which he'll tell us about because it's a really interesting story. And he's also a noted television personality. So we are genuinely graced by a celebrity here today. Chef, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Far from celebrity, but I appreciate the accolades.
So tell us how. I love hearing people's origin stories. How did you get into being a chef? My stepbrother's claim to fame was he had a restaurant for a couple of decades down in Nashville, Tennessee, and his claim to fame was that he said he learned to cook in self-defense because my stepmother was such a bad cook that it was the only way he could survive his childhood. How did you get into cooking? Hopefully it was a better story than that one.
It's actually somewhat similar. So I appreciate his story. I actually got into cooking strictly because, similar to that story, I had two working parents. They worked late into the night every day, and I was kind of fending for myself at home. It gets old getting pizza and McDonald's or 20, at the time, I think it was like $10 left on the counter, figure it out, have your sister pick it up type of situation. But I started watching old PBS cooking shows on TV. At the time, this was like pre-Food Network. So the only thing you could get cooking-wise on TV was Jan Can Cook, Julia Child, Jacques Pepin, those old school dump and stir cooking shows. I became obsessed with them. And I would fake being sick from school to stay home and practice or at least attempt to cook some of the food that they were exhibiting on the shows. And that was my initial love of cooking. I never thought that it would become a career. Although when I got my first job, when I was like 14 or 15, it was for a catering company. And then my next job was at a hotel restaurant, and then so on and so forth, continued in that industry until ultimately when I was about 20 years old and 2 years into college studying something totally separate, I realized, I like the kitchen. I like restaurants. I think this is what I should be doing because I'm spending all my time in restaurants and cooking and not necessarily studying philosophy and piano performance, which is what I was supposed to be studying. So
philosophy and what was that? Piano performance?
Yeah, philosophy and piano performance. Those were my two areas of studies at college. I went to a small liberal arts college up in Maine, and then ultimately, made my way out west and kind of got on the culinary tour, did my apprenticeship, went back to culinary school, and then back to school to get my food service management business degree, and ended up, full-time in the restaurant industry.
Well, that's fantastic. That's quite the story. How did you continue cooking through school, through college when you were up in Maine, or how did you? I'm presuming you didn't just drop cooking for 4 years.
No, so when I was in college, so I got up to school, and of course I was like, well, I got to get a job. I need spending money, the regular. I
How am
actually,
I going to buy beer?
yeah, exactly. And what's interesting, and maybe we'll go full loop on this. I was up there. I was also a runner. I was a distance runner. So it was like
Hence
my
the
fitness.
hat. I got it.
Exactly. And I got a job at a local lobster restaurant, and part of that included lobstering, helping out at the docks, working in the restaurant, and that's what I was doing full time. And then worked at a Denny's up there, and kept working in restaurants. But I ended up spending. I was in the restaurant like 80 hours a week. I stopped really going to classes. I was spending way more time deep in what I call the pirate ship of the kitchen, and not necessarily in the library, although I was in the library from time to time.
Yeah, well, it seems to have turned out okay for you. So I guess did you graduate from that school or did
No,
you
I,
just
I I left after 2 years. After 2 years, I left, and I actually hitchhiked from Maine to Wyoming. I got a job with the Grand Teton Lodge Company that summer, working in restaurants out there. It was going to be just a summer gig, and my plan was to transfer. I'd applied to some universities out west. I loved the bite of the wilderness, the Wild West, and ended up on Mount Hood in Oregon, at a ski lodge called Timberline, which had an apprenticeship program up there for a culinary apprenticeship program, and went through that program before I went back to culinary school.
yeah, I just, funny thing, I just watched a video of a guy who started a hike around Mount Hood at the Timberline Lodge. Beautiful place and a beautiful location. You must have been, it's not like Maine where you've got these little bumps they call mountains.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the real deal out there.
Oh, it was amazing. It was amazing. I used to go up and I'd work the 6 a.m. breakfast shift to start, and then I would double and work a night shift. And then I would put on my headlamp and I would actually snowboard home 3.5, miles through the Alpine into the chalet I was living in with 10 other guys. And would snowboard on all my breaks up there. I think my record was like I went like 300 days snowboarding because they've got the glacier right on the front. It's really the only place in kind
Yeah,
of
you
the
can you
continental
can
US.
ski year round there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Middle of the summertime, it was hilarious going out, 80-degree weather on my break, snowboarding the front of the glacier in, shorts and a t-shirt.
So you're additionally a ski bum or snowboard bum, I guess. That's
Well,
excellent. I like that. I'm a big skier myself. You can see the one of the pictures behind me is of Tuckerman
yeah,
Ravine
yeah.
uh, on Mount Washington in New Hampshire, which is where I now live. That's awesome. Okay, so you started out in Maine, so that must have given you an interest in the seafood side of things, because obviously you were working in a lobster as a lobsterman, you said, right? And then in some sort of seafood restaurant there.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so interesting. So that's now, did you ever pursue um academically a cooking career, or was it all just into the kitchen?
Yeah, so I did after I did my apprenticeship in Oregon, and was deep in the kitchen there. That was about a year. I went back and I went to Johnson Wales University in Colorado in Denver. So they started a culinary school there. I mean, Johnson Wales is based out of Providence, Rhode Island. One of the two kind of more well-known accredited culinary schools, CIA being the other one. But I wanted to go to Johnson Wales because I wanted that full. At the time, I don't think CIA was accredited, so I wanted to get the degree, transfer all my credits from Bates. So I went and did the culinary program at Johnson and Wales in Denver and worked full time out there. And was there for 2-3 years, and then ultimately did go back to the East Coast, Boston, worked there at the Ritz-Carlton while I was simultaneously commuting 3 days a week to get my business degree at Johnson and Wales in Providence to get my food service marketing and business degree. So, I did go back and kind of formalize everything while simultaneously working full time.
That's awesome. Now, we got connected to you through Brian's work on Twitter. Why? Let's talk a little bit about that. I know you've got a little bit of a health story. Tell us a little bit about that aspect of your cooking career, because I think that's really interesting.
Certainly. So, part of the reason I ended up loving the restaurant so much in the kitchen was because I had horrible stomach issues. I thought they were associated with my running. And when I got to college, I had a real bad stomach growing up in high school, and the running exacerbated it. But running was my life. I was a great runner. It was what I did and my identity. And
What's your marathon time? What's your best marathon time?
oh, I've been doing a lot of the ultras kind of piece. I'll put it to you this way. My half is really the only time. I'm a sub 120 half guy now.
Nice.
But I was
Nice.
I was a 4:15 miler in high school, 4:17, and let's see, 25:10 college 5 mile as a freshman. But I quit because my stomach was so bad. I completely quit running. I associated my stomach issues with the running. And then I buried myself in the kitchen because my stomach was so bad that I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't travel. I couldn't even like leave the house. And in a kitchen, you don't go anywhere for 12 to 14 hours. There's a bathroom right there. And it was the only comfortable place for me. So that was why I actually ended up in the restaurant industry. Ironically, kind of like a chef with stomach issues who ended up in the restaurant industry for safety purposes. And
Yeah,
I
I've
stopped.
told I've told the story before. Before I fixed my diet, I had similar issues, and I used to carry a backpack around with a roll of toilet paper in it, just in case of emergencies. It's a miserable way to live. And one of the things I miss croissants having fixed my diet. I do not miss having to carry a roll of toilet paper around everywhere.
Okay. Hey, you know what? There's ironically there's layers to both toilet paper and croissants.
Yeah, yeah. That's hilarious. Okay, I don't know quite what I don't know
That's the
what the
pull
takeaway
quote.
from that
Everyone's
one
going to
is,
watch this now.
but okay, so were you able to were you still just kind of suffering along with the stomach issues, or were you able to learn how to deal with it while you were in the kitchen, where obviously you have all the control over your food effectively?
Yeah, so I was able to manage it, right? Like and also I was less anxious. So, it's kind of the cart and the horse situation. Like the anxiety create makes the stomach worse, then the stomach being worse makes the anxiety worse, and it's kind of that they play off of each other. And but I was able to manage it over time and become more comfortable and confident in the kitchen. It was definitely difficult, but my life revolved around when my stomach wasn't going to bother me, when what I could eat or couldn't eat. I mean, it got to the point where if I knew I was going to travel, it was like I wouldn't eat for a day and I would just starve myself. So there was really no issues and or take a ton of Imodium. Uh, I started really researching what it could have been, doing food elimination diets, all that stuff. And, the old advice was just, it was never anything that worked, right? Like, I mean, by the time I was 22, I'd had like 6 colonoscopies, 3 upper GIs, endoscopies, you name it. Everything kind of came out as like it's a syndrome, then nothing that we can specify in terms of saying this is what it is, take this pill. I tried a ton of different medicines, but ultimately I did manage a lot of it through my diet. Now, fast forward to today and knowing some of the things I know about what I was eating and how I was eating, specific to the seed oils, and I go back on it and I understand why the diet changes I had made still didn't work, because I hadn't eliminated really what was exacerbating the issues. I mean, let's cut to the ending first. Eliminating a lot of the seed oils and working with my diet, a lot more protein, higher quality protein, decreasing the omega-6s has really helped me like solve this 90%.
Okay, so that was one of your triggers. Was the seed oils. I would
Yeah,
presume,
yeah.
I mean, I know, you know, I grew up going up to Maine in the summer, and if you're in Maine, you're eating fried food. That's like 80% of the cuisine. At least it used to be. It's better now. But, you go to a fish stand and you're going to get fried fish and chips, and, that's, I presume, what you were cooking at the Lobster Shack.
Yep. Nonstop. And so for me, it was interesting because everybody was like, well, you got to just eat carbs, right? Eat a ton of carbs. And that reconciled with my running. I understood that.
Right.
And I was told consistently meat was bad. The high protein was really bad. Don't eat the saturated fats. All of those things are going to exacerbate it. And it didn't. And so I listened to that, right? But I was eating, bread studded with seed oils, canola oil, vegetable oil, soybean oil, lobster rolls, those split top butter rolls, that's all canola vegetable oil. Nowadays, people were
Yeah.
seeing a little bit more of the brioche and the butter based breads, but even brioche nowadays, brioche is like 1 part butter, 90, most commercial brioche, and 1 part butter to 99, parts seed oils.
What's a
uh,
brioche?
a brioche is like a French butter based bread, very rich. It's almost more
Ah,
pastry like than it is savory. It's those dark rolls you see on every artisan burger nowadays. We use brioche in our restaurant, but we'll actually make the brioche ourselves with it's milk and butter and flour and yeast. It's a yeasty, buttery roll. But like I said, I mean, the commercialization of any niche product, the seed oils take over.
So
right, right.
it's
Now
quite
that's
literally baked into everything.
Yeah.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly right. Now, so that's an interesting point, because when you were young and you were watching Julia Child on PBS, who once famously said, "If you don't like butter, then use cream instead." And I hope I got the accent right, but I mean, was that your inspiration as you were cooking and going through cooking school? Were you the Julia Child's rebel, holding the flag of dairy high amidst the waving fields of seed oils? How did that work out?
And that's really interesting because in culinary school, because I went back to culinary school when I was a little bit older, and I really was fascinated with every element. And I recall my first year, it was like stocks and sauces and kind of the fundamentals and then nutrition analysis. And in the nutrition analysis course, it was all about cutting butters out of your diet, how to eat in a healthy manner, replacing butters with canola oil, vegetable oil, soybean oil, and to decrease the saturated fats. And that was from day one, it was embedded in what we knew. And ultimately, when I was working also at a food production facility full-time, more artisanal kind of market style food production. And I remember doing like this whole low calorie line. And it was like, okay, here's how we cut out the fats, the saturated fats, and replace them with better unsaturated fats.
Quote
So
unquote
for our
better fats. Yeah.
Yeah. So like all of our vinaigrettes, how we were cooking, basting, the use of margarines, right? And I look back on it now, and it's interesting because my parents, who were very health conscious, everything was margarine, oils. We didn't really have, like, we had a stick of butter in our house that would sit in the fridge for so long that I recall when I would put it on bread, I could taste everything that had been in that fridge for like a year and a half.
It's horrible.
It's like the middle of July, and I'm spreading butter on toast because we didn't have any margarine, and I could taste like last year's turkey in the butter.
Wow. Well, I could see why, if you've got a tongue like that, I could see why you became a chef. That must have been destiny. That's impressive.
So it's been part of medical education. It's been part of the mainstream news narrative. It's been part of culinary education. Every corner of our society for decades has been talking about how butter is going to clog your arteries and make your heart explode.
But I mean, this is it. It's fascinating because when you talk to dietitians, which is something I subject myself to on X, I still can't say X instead of Twitter, but I'm trying to. And you point out that since the dietary guidelines became a thing back in 1977, that obesity has skyrocketed. And they come back and say, well, nobody's following them. And I say to them, well, we don't really have a choice because, the food industry has reformulated all of their recipes to comply with the dietary guidelines. I mean, the cooking schools, it seems like, have poor Julia Childs is out the window, and it's really hard to get away from it. And I mean, my experience, I had, kind of a similar experience to you with, if you want to call it irritable bowel disease or whatever. And when I was a kid and I started cooking for myself, I pretty quickly realized that margarine didn't agree with me, seed oils didn't agree with me. So I never had those in my house. I always had butter in the house, and I would cook with olive oil or with butter. I never used seed oils myself, but I would go out when I was living in, Manhattan in New York City. I would go out a lot. And that's what got me, was going to these, now I realize I was going to these restaurants, I was getting seed oils. It was, I used to go eat steaks, and steaks made me feel horrible. And what I didn't recognize until much later was that they were making me feel bad because they slather them with seed oils before they pop them on the grill to cook them. And that's what I was reacting to. And now that I cook my own steaks and I know how to cook a steak, I love steaks. It's one of my favorite foods. But it's so difficult if you're trying to fix your diet, and then you go to a restaurant, like I presume your old restaurant, which was, from what I've read, more of a fast food kind of concept than a haute cuisine. you're eating according to the dietary guidelines. You don't have any choice about it. That's the only thing on option in most of these places. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, so it's interesting, and I'll tell you what, where I kind of was having this serendipitous segue into the no seed oil diet was when I got into seafood, right? And I started this. It was a fast casual concept called Slapfish, and our focus was on sustainable seafood, local seafood, seafood that was farmed properly, and we wanted to be that place in which you could get high quality seafood at the cost and convenience of faster food. We were kind of the Chipotle of seafood. I had become obsessed with studying seafood and the health elements and how we had a seafood deficiency in our diet. And it was all through this prism of the omega-3 fatty acids and the imbalance of 6s to 3s. That was my first understanding, merely within the context of eating more seafood, right? So in my mind, I was constantly thinking about this, and we had replaced, so early on, 2011, when I started it, we cooked everything in butter, ghee, olive oil on the stove and on our flat top cooking. We deep fried in soybean oil because to think outside of that was just silly. That's what you did. You deep fried in soybean oil or, some sort of vegetable oil. However, we were cooking and sauteing in the butter and all of those other items because I was trying to kind of amplify the healthy fats, but never thought, once again, it was kind of accidental discovery. It was more through the lens of eating more seafood and higher omega-3s, not decreasing the omega-6s.
Right. Interesting. So tell us about, so you sold that company a few years ago, I understand. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And swore you were never going to go back into the restaurant business. Is that correct?
That is 100% correct.
And so how'd that work out?
Well, I still had a little pizza joint that I have today down in Southern California, but I thought that would just be kind of the fun item, the fun concept that we, made pizza for the family and had fun with that one, and we'd be peripherally involved in the food industry. But within 2 days, I got a phone call from a broker that was like, "Hey, there's this great iconic seafood restaurant on the coast that's gonna give up its lease. You should take it over." And I'm like, no, why would I ever do that? That's the silliest thing in the world. Now, fast forward it was probably 36 hours later, and me and the family are in there knocking walls down. I mean, that's how quickly we couldn't quit. My wife is in the industry too. She's a trained chef, and she's the one who was originally a lot more involved in this. So when I started kind of following Brian on Twitter and really digging into what he was talking about, it pulled everything together and was talking to my wife about it. That's what got the anti-seed oil bite. Like, it kind of galvanized. And what's hilarious, and if she would stick her head in here and say this, is when I went to her with a lot of his information, she's like, "So you'll listen to some random account on Twitter, and I've been saying this to you for 3 years." I'm like, that's how it works. Like,
that's meme magic.
You.
It's the magic of memes. It brings people together.
That's what she said. She's like, you're gonna listen to a meme account on Twitter, but I've been saying this to you for 2 or 3 years, and that's it. I'm like, that's just the way it works sometimes. That's marriage.
Yeah, there was a book that came out many years ago called Real Food by the author was Nina Plank. And I read it and I thought it was great. And I gave it to a guy I worked with, and because he had all sorts of health issues, and then took me a number of years after that to finally fix my diet. And when I came back and was talking to him about my experience, he said to me, "Well, Tucker, I've been doing that for years. It was all in that book that you gave me." I was like, I'm such an idiot. So he managed to turn his health around completely while I was just, putzing along buying raw milk because I'd read about it in that one book and had no clue about all the rest of the stuff she was talking about. Yeah. So yeah, I guess, sometimes we got to get hit upside the head to figure this stuff out.
Well, and some folk I found during residency, speaking with just my average patient in Eastern Kentucky, they narratively already agreed with me. When I would seed pill them, when I would talk about seed oils, they'd say, "Oh, I only use olive oil and butter." Like, so they, that's what they identified with, is what they thought was high quality. What they didn't realize was that most olive oils are fake, food fraud, adulterated. Even if you go to a restaurant and they say olive oil, it could be fake. Most of their packaged foods have a bunch of seed oils in them. They don't realize, like what you said earlier, it appears to be default that if you fry something, it's going to be some sort of nondescript soybean oil box that shows up out of a food truck, out of a delivery truck. And So it's like narratively, we're already winning. It's just how do we get restaurants to make better choices and use better quality products? How do we get more options out there? Because a lot of folks, like you all said, hey, I didn't buy the stuff, but I was still suffering from XYZ conditions. When you take that extra step to eat at different restaurants and buy different foods, or be more vigilant about what kind of olive oil you're buying, just overnight can make the biggest change. So just being more aware and having better options.
So, Chef, tell us how your new venture is different from the Slapfish restaurant chain.
Well, so I had franchised Slapfish, and that comes with its own set of challenges because everything you do, you have to scale across a multi-state enterprise, and you've got to also convince your investors or your franchisees why it's a good thing to do. When it came to the health element, even just with the seafood, right? Like convincing somebody to buy $1 a pound more product that you can't communicate to the guests is a better product, easily in one soundbite was very difficult.
Comes right out of your profit.
So that was some of the
it comes right out of your profit margin. Your investors aren't going to like that.
No, of course not. And then furthermore, you're trying to sell them on, well, it's going to increase top line sales. And then ultimately, sales solves everything. But that takes time, right? So, after the Slapfish venture, we realized that, what we perhaps were up against or what we were frustrated about was just the inability to make quick changes and do things the way we really wanted to do it from the heart. So when we did decide to open Calico, we said, look, we're going to really lean into this and do everything we want to do. It's this new birth of a restaurant concept where we can off the bat redo everything and do it the way that we want. And that would include at the time, making sure that all of our seafood was integrated through our own vertical supply chain, both from an aquaculture perspective and a local seafood perspective. The beef we were buying was all from farms we knew what they were feeding them, like carrot raised beef, etc. And then lastly, as my wife and I were going into this and getting, Twitter was taking over, I said, look, let's just go into this, no seed oils, and let's figure out how we can maximize profits, getting rid of seed oils, and still, and still be able to operate in a usual manner, right? Like it's not going to add an extra step of labor to put tallow in the fryer. And then we figured out the dishes. We did tastings and which dishes needed higher heat, how we would cook, how we would finish. So we actually completely eliminated seed oils from a cooking perspective. And I've always been transparent and said it's been difficult to be 100% seed oil free because there's still certain applications or products that we get that might have the seed oils in them, i.e. mayonnaise, right? Like when we make sauces, we've yet to find a commercial seed oil free mayonnaise. When I make it in-house myself, it breaks with some of the other ingredients over a gallon. So we're actually working on developing our own avocado oil mayo right now in bulk. But that's a side topic. But from a culinary perspective, cooking, right? So cooking in beef tallow, bacon fat, duck fat, ghee, olive oil, which we know is real olive oil, avocado oil for that high smoke point. Although ghee also has a higher smoke point, and then integrating that into the operations, cooking, finishing, whole butter, etc. And we did it off the bat. We don't necessarily market it, to be honest, like the way I think some other operations do. It's just kind of who we are. A lot of times guests don't understand how they feel so clean after eating our fried food, fish and chips and beef tallow, right? Like it almost is there's some intellectual dissonance there, but we're the best fish and chips in SoCal. People are blown away by our fish and chips. So
yeah, that's an interesting comment. I had right after I fixed my diet, I had Thanksgiving and all the family over, and I didn't tell them that it was a paleo Thanksgiving, right? I just, we had a turkey and we had, mashed potatoes and everything. And what was really interesting was that everybody loved the food and nobody went back for seconds. Not a single person finished their plate and went back for more. And they all loved it. They were like, oh, this is great. But I mean, that's so contra to the usual American eating experience. And I mean, this was with, a group of people, I think everybody in that room, except for my daughters and myself, wound up getting diabetes. So they were a unhealthy group, used to eating an American diet, and they still had this immediate reaction to a healthy meal of, wow, I feel so much great, and I mean, for me, it was life altering because I used, with my food issues, I hated Thanksgiving because it basically meant I would have to go lie down for 6 or 8 hours after eating. And this time I felt so great. I cleaned up the whole kitchen by myself. I was like, I feel awesome. So yeah, I could see that. Now tell us about, so how is this working out? How you're doing your fish and chips and tallow?
Yeah, we do beef tallow for our fryers, right? So our fryers are all beef tallow. Um, and
And how do your guests like it?
oh, they absolutely love it. Like, it's most of the demographic, the populace, whatever you want to call it. I don't think they understand seed oils, right? You start to talk about seed oils and they're like, oh God, here we go. What are you, a conspiracy theorist?
Right.
Um, and
And the answer is yes, but
yeah, I guess
yeah.
so. But so that's where I have really repositioned the way in which I sell it, if you want to call it sell it, although if they've already eaten it, I'm not necessarily selling it. That it's a quality thing, right? So what I've noticed, and this goes back to my world in sustainable seafood, is that when you try and explain to people about why they should eat sustainable seafood, like, most people, they'll say that they care about the environment and they do things because it's for an eco-friendly manner. But when you actually privately list all the reasons people go out to eat or what they're looking for, it's typically cost, convenience, quality, right? Like, that's it. And at the
Right.
bottom of the list is the environment. Now, of course, if everybody was sitting around at a dinner party, the number one thing would be like, oh, I'm here to help the environment. But we know that's not the case. We did a lot of this market research when I ran the program at the aquarium. So I had realized
Oh,
earlier.
sorry, the program at the aquarium?
So I started a program
Were you
originally.
running were you running the fried fish stand at the aquarium?
No, when I left, in 2008, when the economy tanked, I was running a multi-unit restaurant group along the coast in New Jersey, another seafood restaurant. I've always been deeply involved in
Okay.
seafood. I lost my job, and I was just randomly an opportunity. A headhunter had come to me and said, we're looking for a chef with a marketing degree who loves seafood to start a sustainable seafood program with the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. I'm a Jersey boy living in Jersey. The difference with this program is, unlike the Monterey Bay Aquarium program, which is a consumer-focused program, the CEO of the aquarium realized that 90% of the seafood in California was consumed in restaurants. So the only way they could really make a change with the sustainable seafood being served was through chefs. So instead of educating consumers, it was kind of a push-pull marketing approach. He said, I'm going to bring a chef on board to train other chefs on what to serve in the restaurants. So I was tasked, I got a grant from the Pacific Life Foundation, 3-year grant, to start a sustainable seafood program to get people to eat more of the right types of seafood. And I realized early on in that program that I had to figure out a way to connect sustainability with one of those top 3 drivers for when you go out to eat, right? Quality, cost, and convenience. Because I couldn't just go tell people, you're saving the environment. They're like, I don't care. I just give me my fish and chips. Well, the same logic or approach or kind of rubric applies to the seed oil piece. When I talk to my guests, is I can explain to them all this granular health stuff, but they don't care. What I realized is that if I leaned into the quality element, right? And that's what's important here is that the seed oils aren't just bad for us, from what I know, and obviously you know this in a much more a deeper level. They're junk from a culinary perspective. You're
Okay, explain that.
So what I've noticed in all of this research I've done in side-by-side taste test comparisons is that when you're cooking with this fryer oil, right, you're getting a bitter, acrid oil that breaks down over time. It's junk. I mean, soybean oil, canola oil, whatever they mix it all with. I mean, it has no flavor. It tastes stale and it tastes acrid, in my opinion, bitter. When we started cooking in tallow, the richness, right? We had guests that would walk by we have an open kitchen, and they're like, are you guys making donuts back there? I mean, it just smells so good. And we had talked previously when we were all chatting about driving by McDonald's in the 90s, right? You remember that smell when you drove by a McDonald's? And it's because they cooked in beef tallow.
Right.
And the donut analogy is because they use shortening when they cook donuts. Most of these kind of hole-in-the-wall donut joints are still using this type of shortening or tallow. Where I buy my tallow, it's in the donut section. Just so you know.
That's interesting.
So I have to buy it I have to drive every week to a massive restaurant wholesale store because I can't get it through my purveyors. Yeah, they don't have it. And I filled the back of my truck up with these massive 50-pound blocks of tallow. And I get it from the massive donut baking section of that wholesale supply store. So
That's fascinating.
That's
That is
heroic.
fascinating. So donuts could be a health food potentially. I mean, they probably have a little too much sugar, but if you're,
Crack the code here.
yeah, there
yeah,
we go. There we go.
save the donuts. But so then we get into like the bacon fat, right? The duck fat, the ghee, the butter, all the other oils. And I'm explaining to our guests, like, when chefs cook, and because this oil is so cheap, they fill these squeeze bottles with it, and it's just rolling 24/7, or at least 14 hours a day on this flat top that's at 375 degrees. And this oil just sits there, and it cooks and it cooks and it cooks and it breaks down. It's already flavorless and disgusting to begin with, but now you add just hours and hours of high heat, smoking. It's just breaking down. This is horrible for you, and that's why your food always tastes so disgusting and bitter. Well, because of the fact that these fats that we use cost a lot more, the way in which I've hedged from a culinary or financial perspective is that I said to my guys in the kitchen, this is a much higher quality, expensive product. Therefore, we need to use less of it. We cook with too much oil generally when we cook in America.
Right.
Oil isn't water, and everything doesn't need to be shallow fried. Like traditional French cooking, the joke is that fat is flavor, but real French chefs use a marginal amount of fat because they don't want to mute the other flavors, right? So fat also mutes some flavors when it's used in excess. So I replaced everything in my kitchen, all the squeeze bottles, and we started using just these silicone brushes. They're beaded brushes. So the fat beads onto them, and we brush our flat tops, we brush our pans, and we use a marginal amount because the cost is higher. And we cook with a lot less oil, and then we wipe our pans out, right? So we only bring it up to that simmering, shimmering smoke point once, and we wipe it out and we start fresh. So when I explain this to my guests, we're using less oil. We're only using it one time. It's a high quality. It's fat. It's animal fat. It's rich in flavor. It's allowing all these other flavors to come through, and it's not muting with this acrid, bitter flavor. People like have this intellectual switch with it. That makes complete sense. And we get guests that come back and they say, I will never eat fried food anywhere else but at your restaurant. They're not seed oil advocates. Their body reacts differently. Well, we know why, right?
Yeah, it's an entirely different experience for them. That quality is a different experience.
Yep.
Well, and that's fascinating what you say. I mean, about the acrid taste, because in researching this stuff, I've come across a couple of interesting little factoids, I guess you could call them, is that a lot of the flavorings, the polyunsaturated fats are very unstable, and they break down into all sorts of things as they're getting oxidized. And some of those are actually things that are used as flavorings in the food industry. So one of the worst of them is something called 2,4-hexadienol, which is, we're not going to go to chemistry class here today, but it's what happens when the omega-3 fats in something like soybean oil break down, and it's used as a food ingredient. It's used as a flavoring. It's also recognized as being a carcinogen, and it causes lung cancer, right? Which is, they've demonstrated that in animal models, but it's also why there's an epidemic of women who do most of the cooking around the world who never smoke, who are getting lung cancer. They think it's because they're, in China, this is a huge problem. The more you stir fry with canola oil or soybean oil, the more likely you are to come down with a case of lung cancer, never having smoked, right? So even, just from that health perspective, forget about what's going in your mouth. Just being in the kitchen can be a menace.
That's fascinating. That is. I mean, and not even really understanding all the science behind it, but just from kind of a high level perspective.
But I mean, you've probably seen that. If you let an oil get smoky, it is. I mean, I've done that, and it just, with like olive oil, and you are coughing.
Yep.
I mean, it's like sitting next to a cigarette smoker almost.
That's what I was going to say is that experiencing that toxic plume that just sits off the flat top or the pans that are constantly reused over and over and over again as that high temperature burns. And I've seen it not just smoke, I've seen it ignite, right? Like a lot of kitchens, you talk about the steakhouses. You're right, by the way, because I've worked at a steakhouse. I was a chef of a well-known steakhouse in New Jersey. And we were trained by the corporate executive chef right off the bat is that we had a rub. It was like whole garlic sitting in canola oil that sat next to the grill at like 400 degrees that you have to rub the steaks, and then you throw it on this infrared broiler, and it immediately catches on fire. And then I recall being taught, like, this is the charbroiled flavor everybody wants. And I recall when I would flip these steaks, seeing the smoke as if it was the side of a house after a house fire with that gray soot that sits on it. And they're like, that's the flavor. And I always found it to be pretty disgusting. I mean, and that's what occurs over and over again, those reactions, those in the kitchen when people are cooking with these low quality oils. So we go back to the qualitative element of this. And, that's from a culinary perspective. If I just wipe out the whole, seed oil health conspiracy and all that, let's just look at this from a quality perspective. This is what you want to eat from the purposes of eating high quality food that tastes good and is clean.
Yeah, when I fixed my diet, people used to ask me, isn't it I can't eat wheat and I don't eat seed oils. And people would ask me, isn't it hard? Don't you miss it? Isn't it restrictive? And my answer was always that I eat so much better now than I ever did in my life. I will go to restaurants for convenience, but I don't go to restaurants because the food's better than what I have at home, because it virtually never is. Some things like sushi, I can't be bothered to make, right?
Yeah.
If I go out to a restaurant and I order a steak or a hamburger, it is not going to taste as good as what I have in my house. And it's like the quality argument is real, and the difference in how you feel after a meal is, for you and I went through 16 years of irritable bowel disease leading to a colon resection. It was horrible. It was a horrible thing to go through. And it cleared up in 2 days when I finally decided to take seed oils out of my diet. I mean, it was a bloody miracle. It was amazing.
I'll tell you a quick 20-second anecdote here. I have a line cook who started working with me when we opened the restaurant. And I was explaining to everybody about no seed oils and why we cook and what we cook in, et cetera. And he's a smart kid, but, not on a culinary level, very fundamental 101. So he eats in a restaurant all the time, young, right? Like 22, 23-year-old who probably just has ramen at home. We let everybody eat for free at the restaurant. So he's eating now in the restaurant. His whole diet is what we serve. So about a month, 6 weeks in, I had somebody bought like a bunch of Doritos, right? And they were in the back of the restaurant. And I was like, hey, you guys can have these. It was a mistake order or buy, whatever. Like, anybody who wants them can have them. So he walks by. I was like, hey, if you want to take any of these, he's like, no, I'm not eating those, man. I'm like, oh, I was like, you don't like Doritos, right? Like,
who doesn't like Doritos? Yeah.
And he's like, no, he goes, since I started working here, I haven't eaten any seed oils. He goes, I've lost 35 pounds. And I had noticed that he'd lost a lot of weight. He goes, I haven't been working out. He's like, he goes, I have no stomach issues. He's like, my diet feels amazing. So I'm just sticking with it. He's like, no Doritos, no nothing for me. Like, I hadn't been preaching it to him. It's just that his diet at the restaurant, that's what he's been eating day in and day out, because we feed people for free. So he's a poor young line cook who eats all of his meals at the restaurant, changed his body, changed his life, changed everything. He's like, my skin's cleaned up. I didn't realize
the acne's gone away. Wow. Somebody asked me about that the other day.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's just that you start working in a kitchen and get help in a restaurant kitchen and get healthier. That you could tell that story to anybody and they'd go, please explain why. How is that possible? That's incredible. Because the narrative now is, if you want to be healthier, don't eat out. If you want to be healthier, eat at home, cook at home, don't eat out. But it's what we're talking about here is what makes the difference.
That's really an amazing story. And the kid the fact that it was so severe that he made the connection and was like, okay, I'm not going to have a bag of Doritos. That's really astonishing.
Well, and he hadn't said anything to me, right? Like, so it's not like he came into work every day and was like, man, this no seed oil thing, chef, it's great. Like, never said a word to me about it. Like, I never noticed it. This was 6 weeks later. And then the bag of Doritos situation happened. And he's like, oh no, I'm not eating any seed oils.
So he lost 35 pounds in 6 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, and once again, maybe it was 6, maybe it was 8 weeks, and maybe
quickly. quickly and without
he was
trying.
exaggerating. However, both my wife and I had said, we're like, wow, he's lost a lot of weight. She made a joke to me. She's like, do you think he's on drugs? Like that's how much weight he had lost. And come to find out, by the way, now a year later, or almost a year later, like we've gotten to know him very well. He's like very religious kid. He's like, he's not a, he's not into extracurricular activities. Because
Nowhere
at
close.
first we were joking and we're like, we don't, you don't know someone and they're losing a lot of weight. You're like,
does he have a problem?
Yeah.
Fair question. Yeah, no, that's just being a caring boss.
Yeah, this seed oil free thing is almost comical when people start to experience the positive effects. Like when people say, "Look, I'm not going to the gym more and I lost weight," or "I'm not doing this and I lost weight and this cleared up and I don't sunburn anymore." These kind of crazy things that people. One of the most entertaining and common messages that I'll get as seed oil disrespecter is, "I thought it was bullshit until XYZ." Until I experienced this. I was totally ready for this to be a bullshit meme, that it wasn't true until it happened to me.
Yep.
So now tell us, so you went to cooking school, you'd watched Julia Childs, may she rest in peace, and these other people on PBS, and you went to cooking school and they told you to cook according to the dietary guidelines. How did you learn how to start using all these traditional fats in your restaurant and in your cooking processes? Did you go to the old bookstore and find a copy of, to one of the Julia Child's old books or something? How did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, look, French cooking is always the foundation of like a real haute cuisine, American cuisine. So it was the real fats were stitched in early on. For me, it was also like a curiosity, and I've always challenged kind of the common narrative. It's just who I am. Call it annoying, or call it intellectual curiosity, whatever. But the real trigger was the seafood piece, right? So understanding why a higher healthy omega-3 profile in our diet is important, and understanding it from the seafood perspective kind of opened up my world to that omega-6 to omega-3 imbalance. And then what I learned early on was that we consume so much beef and chicken, and so much of the beef and chicken, because just so you know the numbers I'm talking about, it's like 18 pounds per capita seafood in the US and like 90 to 100 beef and chicken per capita pounds a year. Alternatively, like Japan is 200 pounds of seafood, right? And they don't suffer from the same ailments in this Western diet that we see in places like Germany, England, United States, France, Canada, Mexico, this Western diet. So I started really digging into it from that perspective. And that's where it opened up my eyes to more of, and sorry, I go back, but the beef and chicken are being force fed what? What are they eating? Soy, corn.
Grains, corn, soy, all the stuff that we make these oils from.
Yeah, and I was under the impression that the beef and the chicken was great, but I didn't realize how that was also exacerbating this omega-6 imbalance. Unless you're eating, of course, a lot more of the grass-fed or even the ruminants with things like lamb or the like. And I was involved from kind of a regulatory perspective in a lot of aquaculture operations that were coming out in the early 2000s, 2005, 2010, and how they were adjusting feed, right? So the thing about aquaculture is that from the environmentalist perspective, they don't want you to take wild fish in order to create a pound of farm fish, because they're like, well, you're relieving pressure off some of the larger mid-level wild stocks with the farm product, but then you're removing a lot of the bait fish. So what they were actually pushing for, and this is very interesting, is that in order to fix the feed conversion ratio in aquaculture and decrease the carbon footprint, you need to feed the fish corn and soy to match.
So wait, you ran through that real quick. So they're discouraging you from feeding them sardine or mackerel or the smaller bait fish that
fish meal
a salmon would be eating in the wild, right? Because and I mean, I guess from a certain perspective, it makes sense. They want to relieve the pressure off the fisheries completely. So to do that, you have to remove these fish from the food chain. And you're doing that by feeding them corn and soy.
Corn, soy, and feather feed. So feather feed was huge. And feather feed was encouraged by a lot of
what's feather feed?
Chicken, ground chicken, chicken scraps, which...
Right.
those are really high in the omega-6s.
Right.
And what they realized is that it was changing the profile of a lot of the farmed salmon, right? And then ultimately tilapia as well, which was one of the most highly consumed and farmed species in the world. And that was that omega-6 profile in the farmed tilapia that led to the headlines in the 2010, 2015 that tilapia is worse than bacon, tilapia is going to kill you, etc.
Because it's high in omega-6.
So high in omega-6, which I find fascinating that's what they went after. And just so you know, from a political perspective, the reason why this is that there is a multi-billion-dollar interest industry to eliminate the farming of aquaculture in the world, funded primarily through you guessed it, wild capture fisheries. They see it as a competition.
Well, yeah, and it is a competition. I mean, okay. I mean, I have mixed feelings about farm fish. We had in our episode 5, Tom Brenna on, who's a world expert in omega-3s and human nutrition and worked for a similar organization to yours, or works with a similar organization to yours. And I mean, we aren't going to solve, let's just put it this way, we're not going to solve the lack of omega-3 problem in our diet through wild-caught fish, period. Not going to happen. We will eliminate every fish from the ocean and we will still not solve the problem. So that's frustratingly short-sighted, and it's making me a little pissed off just thinking about it. But okay, so right. But that's it. And I mean, farm fish can be done correctly. It may not be quite as beneficial as wild-caught fish, but it can be a reasonable alternative, especially when you're comparing it to like industrial pork or industrial chicken, which are, basically soybean oil on, 2 or 4 legs.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of what I go into, right? So and I think we think of farming as these polarized extremes. So there's a wide spectrum when it comes to farming. And one thing that I've really been pushing big time is stock fortification, right? Stock enhancement. So you can utilize the mechanisms of farming and aquaculture, but you can do so in a farmed and wild setting. So 60+% of the seafood that comes out of Alaska is farmed. People don't know that, and it's labeled as wild Alaskan seafood. Well, it's farmed in the sense that it starts off in hatcheries, it's raised to a degree, and it's fortified, and it's released into the wild. Well, is that farming? So Alaska says no, although the Alaskan Department of Fish and Game, if you go on their website, they talk about all their hatchery production. But from an aquaculturist or a scientist perspective, that's fish farming. It's just not full spectrum fish farming. Right. I love that. I love that procedure, and I think it's a way that we can consume a lot more seafood without depleting many of our wild stocks. California white sea bass in the 1970s and 80s was commercially overfished to commercial extinction. Well, Hub SeaWorld created the first of its kind stock fortification in the 80s. White sea bass, California white sea bass now is beyond its commercial maximum sustainable yield by way of stock fortification. I mean, it's the most incredible stock success story. Why isn't that being done all over the world or all over the United States? Is because bureaucracy, right? Red tape.
Right.
We can't do it. We're the only country without an open ocean aquaculture policy because we think it's bad for the environment. And here's the irony. 80% of the seafood we consume in the US is imported. 70% of that is farmed. We're going to cut off our own nose, spite our face. We're going to say, well, we're not going to set up a policy and do it the right way, but instead we're going to buy it all from China, where they're literally dumping malachite green and antibiotics in their fish farms, shipping it to the United States, and then we're eating it.
Yeah, so that story's been told in a whole bunch of American industries.
Exactly. It is. You're right.
As old as time.
Yeah.
So sorry, I digress, but bringing it back to topic is, so I looked at this as, well, so we were looking at the feed, and that's what took us off this tangent. And they're feeding, it's like, okay, so you want to get people to eat more fish, but then you're feeding them all this omega-6 stuff, and so it's kind of defeating the purpose. So we were looking at a lot of different farms and how you can kind of maximize the feed conversion ratio so that it's a net gain for the environment, and you produce a higher quality fish that's high on omega-3 fatty acids. And it was that research for me on the exterior, right, that got me very, very interested in the fats, got me very interested in the feed, the fats, the profile and balance. And I'd like to talk with you offline about whether the more regular consumption of omega-3 fatty acids in conjunction with a decrease in the seed oil consumption will fix the American diet. Or
well, we shouldn't talk about that offline. We should talk about that now. That's a key point.
Yeah, I was going to say, or now.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm reading a book right now called The Omega Balance by a guy, AJ Hulbert, who I'm trying to get on the podcast soon. And this is, so basically his finding, and he did an experiment that showed this, is that you get the amount of saturated fat, monounsaturated fat, which is like the oleic acid in olive oil, and polyunsaturated fat that goes into your body tissues. We're not talking about stored fat, right? Which is basically whatever you've eaten, but the things that actually makes up the cell membrane of every single cell in your body. Those three big fat criteria are genetically set, right? You're always going to have that proportion based on whatever tissue it is. But the omega-6 and the omega-3 part of the polyunsaturated is determined entirely by diet, right? So you, in order to get back to what I like to call evolutionary health, which is, back when people didn't get heart disease and weren't diabetic and weren't obese and didn't have things like colon cancer and breast cancer in the levels they're at today, you've got to do that by adding omega-3 fats back in. Now, the most effective way to do that is to lower your omega-6 first, because that means you need less omega-3, right? You can't, he had a number in this book. He said, if you wanted to take enough omega-3 to compensate for the omega-6 in the average American diet, you would have to take over 250 fish oil pills a day.
Yeah.
Right.
I've heard something along those lines, and way even back in 2010 related to this.
So if you cut it, he's a retired professor now, so he's been at that game for a while. But getting, first you need to cut back on the seed oils, but you can't, you still need some omega-3 intake, and there are a variety of ways. What we've done to our food supply, right? Grain feeding these animals causes their omega-3 levels to go down. It does that in humans too, right? So you need to fix this health problem, you need to add back the omega-3. You can do that by pasturing animals, like grain-fed beef is much better. You can do it by eating things like, lamb, which I understand doesn't do all that well on a high grain diet. They're all eating leaves, right? Which is where the omega-3s are coming from. So that's, call it the second stage, right? But that is a critical part of the problem. And I mean, one of the most interesting research studies, which was done by the National Institutes of Health, they took mice and they started them off with 1% omega-6, which is what people ate, at the beginning of the 20th century. And they brought them up to 8%, which is what people were eating by the end of the 20th century. And it caused them to get obese. But if they added back 2% omega-3 in the form of DHA, the omega-3 fat that's found in fish, it prevented obesity. Didn't completely prevent it, but it prevented it a lot. And that explains, as you brought up, the Japanese. We have Japanese and Chinese are basically the same genetic background. The Chinese are undergoing an obesity epidemic right now, and the Japanese seem immune to it. And based on that study, you could explain that by, as you pointed out, explaining, well, the Japanese are eating all this fish and it's protective. Meanwhile, in the United States, it's like we've gone to war against omega-3 fats. It's just ridiculous.
Well, okay. So I was getting nervous there that you were going to say don't eat seafood, but
no. I mean, but then we have this problem that, as I said, you can't fix the omega-3 problem with wild caught fish. There'd be none left.
Well, so that's an environmental issue. So I think that's where I constantly talk about the balance of aquaculture. So when I went back and I said, guess where this money's coming from? And I said a lot of the wild capture fisheries. What my contention has constantly been publicly, and I've spoken at all the events from aquaculture to the wild capture fisheries, you'd think I'd be an enemy of the wild fishermen, which many wild fishermen hate me. I say, right, the age-old cliche, all boats, and related to this, all boats are rising with a high tide. So
Right.
the advent of farmed salmon in the world increased the salmon consumption in the world from the like 11th highly consumed fish to the top 3 with the advent of farmed salmon. It helped the wild salmon industry, right, in Alaska. Alaskan seafood market. So more than 50% of the Alaskan economy comes out of seafood. So they're very threatened by the idea of Canadian farmed Atlantic salmon, which
Right.
most people don't realize this. These two species, Atlantic and Pacific salmon, from a genetic perspective, are as different as, lamb and beef, right? So I don't even compare the two. People say, do you eat farm seafood or wild seafood? I'm like, when it comes to salmon, I'm like, they're two totally different species. I eat farmed Atlantic salmon when I want a fattier profile, typically raw, medium rare type of fish, whether it's sashimi or what. And I eat the wild salmon in completely different situations because they're two different proteins.
Right. Right.
But it's actually, when you think about it, if they work together, I firmly believe that synergy will be able to, from a marketing perspective, get American consumers to eat more seafood. Because when we fund campaigns that say friends don't let friends eat farm seafood and farm seafood's going to kill you, people just don't eat seafood, right?
Right. Because they don't, as you said, they're not going to make that distinction when they go out to eat with their friends. Exactly. They're just going to see salmon and say, it's probably farmed. I won't order it.
When I started at the aquarium, the first thing I did was I did a ton of kind of marketing research. And one of the things I did, 1,000-person survey, sample size, and I said, why don't you eat seafood? And at the end of the day, and I won't go through all the elements of this survey, but basically what it was determined was that people are confused about seafood. They're scared, right? So they hear all these headlines from at the time we did the survey, it was 2012. So, right, this was post radiation with the Japanese
Fukushima,
tsunami.
yeah.
So everyone was afraid there was radiation seafood. So that was up there, right? But it was farm seafood, mercury, radiation, and then the farm seafood eats their own poop, or that it's going to kill them, and all this stuff. And I said, so what do you perceive to be healthy seafood? And they said, anything wild, right? And I said, so then why don't you consume wild seafood? And they said, well, we don't know what is wild, what's farmed, and we're confused. I said, so what's the highest consumed protein? Chicken. So you walk up to this, menu, and you ask one question: is the seafood wild or farmed? And they're like, oh, I don't know, right? Like some 19-year-old kid, and they're like, okay, well, I'll have the chicken sandwich,
which is the worst thing you can eat.
Exactly.
From a protein and health perspective.
So, I'm this kind of kumbaya speaker in the 2000s when I was speaking at a lot of these seafood conferences in this role. And I was telling everyone, I'm like, guys, we just need to promote seafood, period. Stop demarketing each other, right?
Right.
We can all come together for just 6 months and market the high consumption of seafood, not wild versus farmed, not international versus local, right? And we don't even really have a seafood trade association in the United States. You've got a milk board, you've got a beef council, you've got all this. The Seafood Trade Association is the National Fisheries Institute, which, don't get me started there, although I speak for them a lot. It's nothing like you see with the milk, kind of the milk board or whatever that is. So, you're right. We would overfish, or there would be a serious externality related to just even switching to farming. However, I think people forget how resilient the ocean is, and that the science and the innovation in the blue investment, when you kind of create this idea of farming and wild capture, right? I call it wild raised. There's a lot to be managed and developed in that world, but we don't do it here in the US, which is one of the most innovative markets in the world because of the role that the NGOs and the nonprofits play from a profitability perspective, right?
Right.
Oysters are actually one of the only proteins that are a net negative environmentally, right? Oysters clean the environment. I always joke, I say oysters are vegan.
Right. Sorry,
so
they're a net negative?
Well, it's a net negative in the sense that it actually helps the environment. Like, or
Oh,
sorry,
it
a net
cleans. Yeah, it's like a
yes.
filter. Right, exactly.
Sorry, positive. I'm thinking financially. So, like every protein, ultimately, at the end of the day, is going to have a cost. And
Right.
but what I'm saying is, an oyster, they're actually you get back. The environment gets money back or a cost, a benefit back because in the consumption of their protein, you're actually cleaning the environment. But
Right.
why are the oyster farms the number one target of the majority of environmental NGOs in the United States? They're shutting down oyster farms left and right.
Why? Okay, I'll bite. Why is that?
Well, not in my backyard. It's pure NIMBYism. I mean, when does the developer become an environmentalist?
Yeah, when he looks out his window and he sees a windmill,
When he
right?
buys his house at the beach.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, I find that surprising. I mean, I visited an oyster farm out in Coos Bay, Oregon, and the they had the restaurant there where they did all the shucking, and all the shells piled around were kind of smelly, I will confess, but it didn't prevent me from having a delicious meal there. But all this is going on underwater. I mean, Japan's been doing oyster farming since like forever. I thought so. They don't want to see it. They don't even want to see the boats going back and forth, I guess.
It's yeah. I mean, it is read up. I'll send you some stories about like Drake's Bay and what the Sierra Club did to Hog Island oyster up there in Sonoma or Central California. I mean, just horrible stuff. But oyster farming's the answer, right? Like we could clean our oceans. They cleaned the Chesapeake Bay with oyster farms. Not for those were not for consumption purposes. That was more for the purposes of actually adding oxygen to the what was it an oxygen dead zone by
Right.
way by way of all the fertilizer that was coming through the watershed from the chicken farms.
Right. Got it. That's really interesting. So let's talk a little bit about I should disclose that Brian and I have worked with a company called Zero Acre Farm that's in the business of trying to come up with a seed oil replacement. It's a high oleic oil and it's low in linoleic oil. So it's supposed to be, straight seed oil replacement, not tallow or butter. But you start getting into the economics, right? And if you're going to buy something like their product at the moment is a premium product and they'd like to get it down to a commodity product. But to do that, you have to start convincing chefs and restaurant owners that this is going to be a profitable operation. And you seem to be of the opinion that you're benefiting from having to drive all the way to this donut store to buy your beef tallow. So talk to us about the kitchen economics and how that's working out in your restaurant.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways of looking at it, top and bottom, right? So number one, driving sales. Anything that has a marketing cachet is going to drive sales, and ultimately driving sales, that's going to fix margins. So the increase, how much money would you spend to increase your sales by $1,000? Do the numbers.
Right.
So if the excess cost of that oil against the soybean oil is, $100 a week, would you spend $100 a week to increase sales by $1,000 a week? Of course,
Right.
anybody, 10% marketing cost or return because it's every week. So there's that. And then there's the use, the operational element that when you are paying more money for a higher quality oil to put out a much better product, you simultaneously can teach your kitchen how to use oil in a proper manner, decreasing waste, using less oil because it's higher quality, right? Less is more from a flavor perspective in many cases. And that in and of itself
Well,
can
especially if you're putting large amounts of crappy acrid soybean oil on it.
Yeah,
I've got to
exactly.
imagine that's a huge win.
Yeah. Now I will tell you. So those are the two manners in which I justify a high quality oil, non-seed oil. Now I have used the latter example with many restaurants and tried to explain to chefs, here's how you do it. Now that argument has worked against me because if they don't believe in the power of a non-seed oil, you basically just gave them a free course on how to decrease their cost of goods by not switching seed oils.
by just using less seed oils.
Exactly. So they're like,
Right.
oh, I love this. This is phenomenal. Thanks. I'm going to do this, but with my seed oils. So the
Right.
hedge, of course, is that, well, no, the idea is, you see, the problem with the seed oils is they're so flavor neutral or flavor negative, right? That if you decrease them, now you've decreased the amount of fat that your customers have been conditioned to be eating in the food. That's just that kind of raw, indulgent fat.
Right.
Versus the difference of the non-seed oils is that that's actually a quality, right? Like that's not a neutral. The tallow has flavor to it. Just drive by the old 90s McDonald's, right? The duck fat has flavor. The bacon fat has flavor. The butter, the ghee has flavor. The olive oil has flavor, right? When used properly, if you don't take it to a smoke point. I have, so that's why I'm curious about the 0 acre oil, the quality element of the actual flavor.
Well, I've cooked with it, of course, and they did a bunch of taste tests when they were first starting out. I think it's been long enough so I can tell this story. It cooked up. I mean, the first thing they did with their first batch, the very first batch, is they made a bunch of brownies, and they did a taste test internally. And
regular brownies. They were just regular.
Yeah, regular brownies. They're in California, so we have to specify they're regular brownies. And nobody could tell the difference. And that was a huge win because nobody buys anything because of it tastes like corn oil, right? People will buy a croissant because it tastes like butter, or the brioche that you mentioned before, right? Nobody buys anything because it tastes like a vegetable oil. It's just, so that was a huge win. And when I've tried cooking with it, it's just, there's no there, right? You taste your eggs, you taste, whatever else you're going to put it on. It just, it's not like olive oil. It's actually, olive oil has a taste. If you use olive oil in a salad dressing, and that's why you use a good olive oil, it's because you can taste it.
Yep.
But I mean, so do you find that you're using another big question, and a point that I like to make, and I made this point to 0 Acre when I started working with them, is that it's known in the food industry that these omega-6 fats are a problem, right? They're not always acknowledging the health aspect, although I can show you articles coming out of the oil industry, the Oil Chemistry Society literature, pointing out the health problems with cooking in these vegetable oils, right? Cargill, years ago, Cargill is, I think, the largest producer of vegetable oils in the world. And Cargill was reading these journals and realized that trans fats were going to go the way of the dodo and be made illegal because of all the harm that they saw from them, right? And Cargill was a big manufacturer of trans fats. So, fats containing trans fats. So Cargill went to one of their biggest customers, McDonald's, and 10 years before the FDA came out and made trans fats illegals, they convinced McDonald's to switch to a low linoleic canola oil. Lower. To avoid the problems of using a high linoleic in a fryer, a high linoleic oil in a fryer, which is faster turnover. You have to buy more of it because it goes rancid faster. There's it has this annoying habit of catching on fire. I mean, I rented a house out in Idaho when I was living there, and the dryer that came with the house had a warning label on the inside of the lid that told you not to dry clothing soaked with vegetable oils because it might burst into flames, right? That's crazy, but apparently that's a problem in the restaurant industry as I looked into this, right? Because they would have, you go by the fast food place, everybody's clothes are soaked in oil from these fryers splattering. You throw it in the back of the truck drives away, it's 100 degrees out, and the truck bursts into fire. I mean, it's nuts. So Cargill convinced McDonald's to switch to a lower, thank you, Brian, linoleic acid fat years ago, right? years ago. Mars, I learned, switched from regular peanuts, which are high in linoleic acid, to a low linoleic peanut for peanut M&Ms. And one of the benefits to them is that the shelf life is 10 times longer, right? Which means less waste. You can have a longer expiration date on the product. So you don't, if it's not sold, you don't have to throw it away so quickly. I mean, there are good economic reasons, and all those economic reasons, right? The rancidity of these fats is what causes all the health problems. And, the industry knows this. And I think that's a point that a lot of people, especially in the restaurant industry, aren't aware of, that there's this underlying trend in the food industry to lower these fats because of economic reasons. And what we're trying to do is bring out the health reasons so that people understand there's an even better reason to do it than just the fact that, it's funny because if you go to a nutritionist and you ask him what's a healthy fat, he'll tell you it's a vegetable oil, right? High in omega-6 fats. And then if you ask him, well, what about fried food? He'll say, oh, no, don't eat fried food. It's bad for you. Well, the fried food's all fried in the same oil that you just told me to eat.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So, Chef, I love what you said earlier about the fish industry and say, like, we shouldn't be anti-fish because then people aren't going to eat fish. In a similar vein, I love to champion all of these seed oil free options because I think that once this meme starts to, crest higher and higher and higher, it will raise the tide for everybody. I mean, we're going to have, if people find out what is real olive oil, it will be a boon for real olive oil producers. When people start looking for tallow, you're going to have this, butchers throw away beef fat right now. We're going to have a tallow renaissance when people say, well, I want to get rid of the soybean oil in our fryers.
Somebody on Twitter just said they went to a butcher and they asked for suet, and the butcher said, what's that?
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And suet, of course, for the audience, is what tallow is made from.
The seed oil free wave. Just saying seed oil free, just saying a low omega-6 diet. What I love about this this meme, right? This idea, a lot of times when you just focus on one thing, this reductionist type of reductive reasoning, it loses power as you extrapolate out. But I like to say that this omega-6 paradigm, this anti-seed oil paradigm, it gains power as you extrapolate out. You get into, like we were talking in the last hour and a half, economics and food quality and health and it's incredible. It's like we don't have enough hours in the day right now to even touch on all these topics. But as this continues to gain traction, we're going to see incredible developments.
So, Chef, do your customers notice the difference?
Yes, 100%. And that's where I go back. You just named, right, like the economics, the health, the environmental aspect.
Yeah, but if your food tastes like crap, none of that matters.
Exactly.
I was going to say, so like for me, right, I live in a superficial world. I mean, my role is to get people to come in and eat dead seafood. It's very, very superficial, and I can only lean into one of these, right? And so I'm going to lean into the quality element and the high quality, the flavor, and getting people back in the door because there's something, right? Like 9 out of 10 times, people couldn't tell you what they specifically love. There's not a secret sauce for why something is successful or why they continue going back to a certain store, a certain restaurant, whatever it is. But it's always got that je ne sais quoi, that why, that something. So for us, it's like, let's develop that why. We don't need to hit them over the head with it, but we know, right? It's the fats.
Right. So what's the difference between the fried fish you serve at your Calico, is your current restaurant, and the fried fish that you served at Slapfish?
The oil. That's it. It's the same exact. Well, and we use a different seafoods cut now because my price, I'm a full service restaurant now with a full bar. So my price point's a little bit higher. So I can use a different fish. We use a wild Alaskan cod for our fish and chips. I was using an MSC certified Atlantic hake product, which actually, frankly, I think hake and cod are somewhat similar. However, the wild Alaskan cachet, when it's fresh like that, it is a much fatter fillet. So you get a fat fillet, which is what makes that nice, beautiful, pearly white bite at the head of the fish. But from the batter's the same, exact same. It's just the oil, right? Or the fat. It's the tallow.
Right.
And the fries too, right? So we use a fat cut, all natural cut steak fry. And the reason I do that is that I love the surface area cooked against the beef tallow. The beef tallow cooks differently, right? It browns things quicker. If you had fresh, clear soybean oil and you cooked a fry in there, it's going to come out very, very pale, light golden. We become very accustomed to like that color in American food. To me, golden brown and delicious. I like a deep golden color, right? Like that's a much more European style. Even some of those kind of real dark, the Maillard browning on the edges of food, that is flavor. And
Now, is that because you're able to use a higher temperature, or is it just a property of the fat?
I don't know. That's where we got to talk to the doctors here. I don't know what it is, but the beef tallow produces a deeper, darker golden color, and it could be because there's solids in it, that are toasting, as opposed to that highly, highly, highly clarified vegetable oil. I don't know.
Interesting.
But it creates a much deeper, darker, richer product. It's unbelievable. I got to stop. We cook all of our own potato chips too. So we do like all these various dishes that come with the house-made potato chips, slice the potatoes and we fry them. So we have this massive Lexan in the front by Expo that's just full of our potato chips that are fried into beef tallow. And it's like a joke at the restaurant that it's the old country buffet. Every single server, every single cook has a bowl of potato chips they're just constantly snacking on. And going back to the old story
and losing weight. They're snacking on potato chips and they're like, I'm leaner than I've ever been before.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is ironic.
Exactly.
I mean, Harvard University years ago did a study looking at the most fattening food in the United States, and it's potato chips and French fries by like a couple orders of magnitude. A potato, or a boiled potato or a mashed potato, is not obesogenic. But through some magical process, when you deep fry it in seed oils, which is what everybody's using, it becomes obesogenic, except in your restaurant, because I guess you didn't get the memo.
We are obesity free.
So this is such an optimistic view too, because the thing that is worst for you, the thing that is making us sick, primarily contributing to the obesity and chronic disease crises that we have, not just in the US, but more so around the world, doesn't taste good, is poor quality. And that is actually an incredibly optimistic thing, because as we know that there is, hope for a better future with better products.
Yeah. Well, and I think we go full circle, because me as the curious guy, I would say to myself, well, then why, right? Why? If it's not higher quality and we have all this other great fat we're throwing away. And I go back to what I learned and what I'm continuing to be taught, that saturated fats are going to kill us.
Right. Which, of course, as we know now, is nonsense and always was nonsense. So another question for you. I know I've known enough restaurateurs and chefs in my life to know that they like to do nothing better than to go to some other chef's restaurant and pick apart what he's doing. Have you had any interactions with your colleagues out in California?
Not in the context of oils.
But I mean, I presume they're coming into your restaurant to figure out what you're doing.
Not
yet. No, they are.
Happening.
A lot of my kind of contemporaries do come in and I explain to them about the oils, but so many of them, it's like, to them, they look at it as that's financial suicide. Actually, a lot of them are just like, you're an idiot. You're never going to make money doing that. And many of them do work for corporations or large multi-unit restaurant groups and they're the chefs for them. And to even bring that idea up would be laughable. I think we're up against a tide of misinformation, like this idea that anti-seed oil is this crazy right-wing movement. Like, to me, is the nuttiest headline. But I did bring that up to a customer the other day and they were like, what are you, some conspiracy theorist? And the fact that is even seeping into a general mindset, when frankly, it's like, I'm a hippie, right? Like, I'm an environmentalist. So look at it from that perspective, is that this is actually better for the environment, but yet it's being pitched. So I don't know who's funding all those articles or how that's getting out into the mainstream. I'm sure you've seen them.
Oh,
Doug.
yeah. I mean, that's how this blog got started, actually. Vice News called Brian and I up to interview us, and I insisted that I record the interview. I never made it into the final product, but their whole story was there's no science to back this up. So episode 0 of this podcast is me schooling the reporter on all the science to back this stuff up, which never made it into the article. So there's, it's propaganda. And I mean, that's a whole political story as to why. I mean, a lot of it has to do with the church, the Seventh-day Adventists, who've been pushing a vegetarian diet, and it's a big ding against a vegetarian diet if people realize that animal fats can be part of a healthy diet, right? Why would you do that? Why would you go vegetarian except for the health benefits? It doesn't taste better. It can taste great, but everybody loves bacon. Nobody wants to give it up. So yeah, there's a whole political subtext here. It's kind of ironic that good food. I mean, when I was growing up, the people in the health food store were the hippies, like you said, right? That's who went to health food stores. It's a kind of a left-wing thing. And the conservatives go to the steakhouse or they go to McDonald's, right? I mean, that's the stereotype, and there's definitely some truth to it. But, it's starting to get out, and people on both sides are starting to realize, hey, there's actually something here, right? That it's not just, when they first hear about it, it's because certain communities have taken it up faster than some other ones. But, when you start going through the research and understand what's going on here, it's pretty overwhelming. But there's a rear guard that's, trying to poo-poo the whole thing.
There's definitely cracks in the glass. People are noticing.
Well, yeah, and it's funny when I tell you these stories, right? Like we don't, we're a non-political organization, right? Like we don't talk to our customers about politics. I kind of know generally in a lot of cases because people talk to me about it. But when I talk about this strictly through the prism of quality, and I've talked to people across the political spectrum, and that makes sense to them, right?
Right.
Like that surface level superficiality, quality, taste makes complete sense to them, and it puts everything else away. So I, kind of in conclusion, that's always the area in which I like to lean into, is that, I don't need to do any intellectual gymnastics to try and convince myself and others that this is the right thing to do. It's very easy. It's higher quality. It tastes better. It's going to be a better product, and the customers are going to want it.
Yeah. And I mean, I know from deep frying myself in tallow, the difference is night and day. And one of the big differences is you don't overeat it, right? You have a little bit and you're satiated. And it's not like, people buy those 5-gallon buckets of fries now at McDonald's, and you have a little portion. And that's actually how I can tell that what a potato has been fried in is how much of it I will eat, right? And the more seed oils is in it, the more you'll eat it, because it's this chemical trigger, right? They're literally making you want to overeat it. And I don't think that's intentional. It's just a happy coincidence, but the effect is definitely there. Well, this has been awesome. Any other things that we missed or that you want to get into or you want to cover?
No, I mean, I've learned so much just in having this conversation. Thank you so much. I'll keep following the memes, and it would be possibly beneficial sometime in the future. We follow up. I'd like to talk to a lot more of my guests about this as I've learned so much here, and maybe I can come back to you with some of their questions that I can't answer.
Oh, we'd love to. That'd be great. Yeah, that'd be really interesting.
And we got to make a pilgrimage to the West Coast.
Oh yeah, man, you're making me so hungry talking about your darn restaurant. This is like so frustrating.
We've got right now, we've got Kentucky, You're in New Hampshire now?
New Hampshire, yeah.
Yep, in California. So
Yep. No, we're on the wrong side of the country. So no, this is great. Where can people find you online? How can they follow up on your work and see what you're up to?
Twitter at Chef Gruel. I'm on Substack under Andrew Gruel, American Gravy. I do a lot of posts on there, some with the seed oil stuff. And Instagram, Andrew Gruel, www.chefgruel.com, all the outlets.
Awesome. And you seem to be frequently on YouTube. There are lots of YouTube videos of your media appearances if anybody wants to watch some cooking shows. Cooking judge, I guess. You've been a judge for a bunch of shows?
Yeah, I was a judge on Food Network for years, did a couple different shows. My claim to fame is I was the co-judge with Meghan Markle right before she got married to the prince.
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. It was like a week before she announced that they were together. But after the pandemic, I stopped doing work with Food Network, and now we're kind of launching into some of our own stuff. So hopefully I'll be able to reveal that soon.
Oh, yeah. New media landscape out there. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Chef, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. It's been really interesting and very educational for us, and I hope for our audience, for both of our audiences. It's been really a neat conversation. Thank you very much.
I love it. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Chef.